one of the reasons why, I put together the function that I lead today, around diversity, culture, and experience, is because they are the reasons people join, and they are the reasons people leave an organization.
Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today I'm delighted to be joined in person by the wonderful Raj Verma. Raj is the Chief Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Culture Officer and employee experience in addition for Sanofi, a global pharma company that we all know very well. Raj, you've had some absolutely fantastic experience, a number of decades worth of people, transformation, culture, and namely global HR experience, which I know you're going to be talking about today. Raj has worked for the likes of Jaguar Land Rover, Ford Motor Company, Sanofi, where he is right now, and of course a number of other global brands, including Sodexo. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, it's brilliant to be here and in our hometown of Leamington as well, even better, which is a world away from the jet-setting usual day-to-day life that you have working for a French multinational. So I guess to kickstart things for today, as we ease into the conversation, talk to us and our listeners a little bit about how you came to be where you are today. So it's a rather humble beginning, wasn't it?
Yeah, look, I don't think my story is remarkable in any way, shape or form. There's many people like me, and I guess I got lucky in certain aspects. So, grew up working class background, a son of first generation immigrant family who moved here in the late 60s. And like most people of my generation, I grew up in an environment where I was just glad to be. So I had great family, great friends, grew up in predominantly a black and brown area. And it wasn't until I went to high school or secondary school that actually I was the only brown boy in the class. And that was my first sort of experience of being a minority as opposed to a majority from the area that I grew up in. So, fast forward a few years, and I was lucky enough to end up at university. I read law, and I had aspirations like many parents of my generation of being a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor. And I quickly realized I'd make a terrible lawyer. I didn't like getting into the detail. I didn't like reading case studies. I didn't have the patience. And I wanted something a little bit more dynamic. So I was lucky enough again to get a scholarship to do a master's in management science, which gave me a bit of an insight into different parts of management and how to get things done differently through people. I really loved that experience. I had a couple of placements, and I was lucky enough to then move on to a blue chip graduate development program. And that was with a company that we now know as Aviva. And at the time it was Commercial Union, and it was taken over a number of times. And that was my first sort of real world experience of being in corporate. And I was there for about 18 months, and I really enjoyed going through all of the different parts of business, from finance to operations to marketing to sales to change and HR. And I really liked HR, and I loved the fact that you could see people change and make the change happen. And I was then, I'd say, lucky enough again to get myself onto the Ford Motor Company graduate program. And my first HR role was in Dagenham, where I worked as in training and development. And that was a real eye-opener, working with the unions and working with an organization where more than 50% of its workforce in Dagenham were from an ethnic minority group, but less than 5% of the management were from an ethnic minority group. And I think that was my first real experience of D&I. So fast forward a few jobs, a few continents, few roles, and I've done international assignments in Australia, where I lived for 4 years. I've traveled all over the world through my international roles. And today, you know, as the Chief Diversity, Culture and Experience Officer, I work in Paris, so I commute every week pretty much and go wherever the job takes me. And that's how I've ended up where I am. And super glad that today's commute was less than 5 minutes.
The shortest commute
it has absolutely been the shortest
last
commute.
year. I love it. And oh my goodness, I mean, that is some whistle stop tour. And you know, one thing that I find remarkable, and I found this remarkable actually since the first time I met you, is you kept talking about luck, and I was like, luck. The question is, does luck really exist? Because, you know, you modestly talk about the background that you came from. And, you know, I know personally, you know, your mum was a seamstress, you worked a number of jobs and, you know, working class background. You know, to get where you are today is really somewhat of an achievement. And I think it takes up until, you know, there's very rare, often reflective moments like now to actually look back and see how far one has come up the mountain as opposed to that constant thing that entrepreneurs, leaders, CEOs, people that I interview, they often negate because they're looking at how far up the hill they need to go almost. But actually, in such a fast changing VUCA world, as the expression goes, that's somewhat of a feat, and especially within the people world, when, you know, HR people many years ago fighting to get a seat at the table, now it's the one that is literally, it's in demand. You know, you can't get a great CDO without headhunting them, or same goes frankly for a global CHRO.
No, I think the world has shifted an awful lot. Certainly post-pandemic, the role of any chief people officer or chief diversity officer has been looked at in a very different way. And I think the impact that's had on organizations, on people, and, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, I put together the function that I lead today, you know, around diversity, culture and experience, is because they are the reasons people join and they are the reasons people leave an organization. So it's so important that you get that right. And part of that whole experience of building something, co-creating it with the people for whom it's intended. You know, I've been super fortunate that I've got a great CEO, a great ex-com who get it, right? They get the fact that these are the game-changing parts of the people agenda that's going to make that difference and sustain it. And I think that's super important to get that tone from the top. And what we've been doing over the past 2 years since I've been there is sustainably building up, you know, the value add that HR brings, or people and culture, which is what we've moved to as part of our whole transformation. So everything we do, we put the individual at the center and we design things with them and for them. And I think that's really powerful. We don't sit in an ivory tower saying this is the way to do it. I go with the 80-20 rule. You know, the cultures in the different countries that we're in are different, and we acknowledge that, right? And part of that is saying, well, 80% of what we're creating is not negotiable because we're trying to drive efficiency and consistency, but 20%, do what you need to do to make it land, right? Make sure that it has impact in your country, and that is the value that we bring.
I couldn't concur more, not only with the fact that people, the role of the people function, HR, D&I, it is the beating heart and the drumbeat that is at the centre of forward-thinking, innovative organisations, in particular within the modern-day workforce that we experience right now. There's 5 generations in the workplace. You know, we all know very, very well indeed that those younger generations, Gen X, Z, the ones that come after that as well. You know, they care so much more about purpose and they care about employee experience. And so the fact that, and look, you know, I know that titles are interchangeable, you know, DEI director, DIBE director, you know, culture I think is a great one, as well as diversity and inclusion, because the two are intrinsically woven. But the fact that there's employee experience in that as well strikes a real chord, because organizations that are looking at the employee experience and not looking at this as a one-way relationship and looking at it as a two-way, they are going to retain their employees, and you know, it's still the war for talent, isn't it?
I'd actually say it was more than two-way. I'd say it's multi-way, because what we're looking at is the human experience at work, not just the employee experience at work. Because, you know, through COVID and lockdown, we've realized that, it's the families that matter as much as the people that we're employing. So we have to look beyond the walls of Sanofi. And that's really important for us, because part of having that level of engagement and the desire for people to stay, to tell others where they work and what they're doing and the purpose of the organization. Earlier this year, we launched a new corporate brand, a new employer brand. And we have a very clear purpose, which is about chasing the miracles of science to improve people's lives. Now, if that's a purpose that doesn't excite you, then I don't know what else would, because we're trying to make a difference and we're trying to do it 360. It's not just linear. And when I joined pharma, I didn't know much about the industry. I'd seen them as clients. I'd seen them as, on the front newspapers of things that they do well, not so well. But actually, the reason people stay is because they are looking to make a difference in the world. And I think for the generations that are coming in, that is super important. And I take my own children, they are more motivated by the why. Why would I want to, give my 20, 30 years of my career to this company, right? So somebody mentioned to me, the war for talent is over, talent won, right? And people have that choice now. And I think part of our remit as an organization is to understand what it is that we need to do to meet where people are.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to be a little provocative, if I may.
Yep.
And I picked up on something that you talked about before, which was very much around this kind of, the multifaceted viewpoint that we have, how things have changed over the generations, but also even over the last decade, because things are just going like the speed of light right now. We talked even about kind of multifaceted titles, diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, D&I, I&D, etc. We're hearing a lot and we're feeling a lot of pressure around the societal aspects of ESG. And, of course, as a forward-thinking healthcare organisation, the societal aspects are super important. What's your take, your personal take on whether this marriage between ESG and the essence specific and D&I and HR, where does that kind of sit? Because I tend to find that people sit in one of two camps, and I'm not entirely sure where I feel I sit, because should they be separate? Should they be combined? Where's that marriage lying?
Do you know, I take the view that when you're in an organization and you're all aligned to one purpose, it's not a competitive sport, it's a collaborative one. And I am not precious where the work that we do around DE&I sit. I'm more concerned about the impact it makes. So in Sanofi, actually, one of the conversations that I had with our head of CSR was we wanted to integrate it into our CSR strategy. So now it's actually one of our 4 pillars. And last year we had our very first ESG investor day. And I spent, a quarter of that was around, and we call it in and beyond the workplace. And it went down super well because nobody else is really talking about it in the same vein. And for me, it doesn't matter where it comes from. It matters more what it does and where it goes. And, the relationship I have with our CSR head, with members of that whole function, we're so well connected, and we do a lot of stuff at the start and we're co-creating it because we're all trying to find the same end game. And that is more important than where it sits in a box or an organization, Joe.
Oh, that is a brilliant answer. I'm trying to find something I disagree with you on, just for viewer interest. But honestly speaking, outcomes orientation, which I know that you're a huge fan of, makes absolute sense. And I mean, it's just fascinating, this whole, we used to talk about CSR, and it's almost like we barely really hear anyone talking about CSR now because the world's moved on. It's CSR, it's ESG, it's S, it's D and I and B, and then E a lot of the time. And you guys have even managed to fit employee resource groups, another of my favourite subjects, into the realms of ESG. Don't want to spend too long on it, but just love to hear a couple of those key poignant areas around employee resource groups for anyone who's wondering what the ERGs stand for. ERGs, ESGs, lots of E's there. But talk to us about that, because investor relations, who would have thought that there would be a marriage between those two groups?
Look, I think, when we set up the whole D&I strategy, which is called All In, and it's there till 2025 to integrate fully into our business transformation, We looked at it through the angle of making sure we set the tone at the top. So we created a diversity board with external members. One of the things I'm always keen to do is to not mark my own homework. So I'm always looking for challenge, for coaching, for support. But at the same time, the grassroots movement is so important. And in Sanofi, when I first joined, we had almost 50 types of ERGs around the world, but none of them were connected. And I felt as if we weren't getting the value that I know that they can bring. So we actually worked with existing ERGs and built a playbook. So ERGs are employee resource groups, which are volunteer-led. But what I tried to do was to make it absolutely part of the strategy. Right. So we brought in global ERG leaders. We have gigs in Sanofi. So we had over 200 people apply for 5 roles. Because the quality was so high, we then introduced deputies as well to help with succession planning. Each of my ex-com members have a role around D&I. So half of them sit on the board and the other half are ex-com sponsors. And for me, it's really important that tone is super clear. But this is the expectation of people who work at Sanofi when it comes to integrating inclusion into our everyday. So these ERGs, we had our first ERG festival in November where they laid out their strategy. So I asked them to put down their KPIs. We've put resource behind it. We've put budget behind it. We've made sure that every single ERG leader has the right profile and access to their ex-com sponsor. So throughout the year, we've mapped out what it is that we can do to support and help them. But they all have a key role to play, from looking at some of the marketing that we're doing, some of the packaging we want to put in, testing some of our videos. Do they feel inclusive? Have we missed a trick? Right? Because we're all learning. We don't have any experts who know everything about D&I in Sanofi. We're all a work in progress and we get it, right? So, which is why I'm always keen to bring the outside in. And that is where our ERGs add a lot of value.
You absolutely have to. And I must hold myself back here from talking or doing an entire podcast about ERGs, because it's one of my favourite subjects. But, you've touched on some brilliant points there. Anyone who's listening in who, God forbid, has not started an ERG, please make sure that you do, because the future for these is strategic business priorities, focus groups. These are an incredible source of knowledge, wisdom, diverse voices, diverse passion, which we all know drives engagement. And of course, greater business profitability. But now, Raj, I'm conscious we talked a lot about the great things, of course, that Sanofi has done. Wonderful organisation, lots and lots of things on the cards this year. I'm very excited about future collaborations. But I'd love to dive back now, if I may, given that we are, of course, kind of framing this podcast conversation around the global piece, the role of HR, forward-thinking, innovative leaders in a global context. Your career, you've worked for household names, Ford, automotive, which I'm sure, to be careful, my husband works for an automotive organisation. Brilliant organisations, but very, very different. Have you had any cultural faux pas? Are there any stories? Because you must have had some serious stories from global regions, your travels, where you thought, oh my goodness, if only they'd had cultural awareness training.
Do you know, when we moved to Australia, somebody said to me, it's fine, they all speak English. And that was true to a certain degree, but it's so nuanced. So when we landed in Oz and we were in Melbourne, and it was chalk and cheese. It was a real learning experience for my wife and the children. And they picked up, the Aussie twang, and they grew up there and they learned the Aussie values and the ways of doing things, and, not to take life too seriously, which is the complete opposite of Brits, right? So we started using something called the Cultural Navigator. So as people were looking to have global teams, or they're working overseas, or they're in projects with people from different parts of the world, we started to ask them to do some of these Cultural Navigator online, tests to see what are some of the likelihood gaps of misinterpretation, right? How are people going to see you, and how are you going to see them? And just to be a little bit more curious, because one of the things that I've learned, working overseas, is that you have to make sure that you stay pragmatic. You have to be agile. You have to look at what's around you. You've got to be pacey. And you've got to keep asking, so what? Because it's so easy to do what you've always done. And what you're trying to do is to have an outcome for that country or for that project. And it is very, very different. And I certainly think with technology over the past 5-7 years, where teams can be global and they're still in their own countries, how do you involve everyone? How do you build some of that psychological safety into the conversations? You know, for people from Asia versus people sitting there from the US, and how do you give everyone equal voice and insight? And we know that if you don't intervene, it will not happen by itself. So I think part of my learning, that I'm really bad at jet lag and I suffer terribly from it, but you know, you've got to take your time to really understand the people that you're with and where they're coming from. You know, and I had a boss once who said, you know, things are never right or wrong, they're just different. And as soon as you start thinking about it that way, you start to build empathy. I guess that's D&I 101 in the olden days, right? It's so easy just to think you're always right, just because that's all you know. So that was the biggest learning in a global role, that you do have to take a step back. You do have to look at big picture, and you do have to put yourselves in the shoes of others. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but that's the smartest way of getting the best outcome for whatever it is that you're working on or through.
It reminds me of the quote, and I'll not get it right now that I've said this, but from To Kill a Mockingbird, where Atticus says to Scout, you never understand someone until you walk around in their skin and actually look at things from that lens, because you're absolutely right. One wants to kind of, you know, from your experience, you presume everyone else's is the same, but, you know, these cultural nuances, as small as they may seem, can actually be huge things, you know. I remember my father went to Hong Kong, actually, to work with my mum, where they adopted my brother and I, and he loves to tell these stories about this Chinese entrepreneur that he worked for called Mr. Mock, rather stereotypically. And he said there was an Australian, actually, Australian businessman came to see him. He threw his business card across the table and he wouldn't do business with him, because the dumb thing at the time was you present the business card facing towards your guest and you present it with two hands, because that's a gesture of politeness. And so not knowing these small things, boom, it's a no business situation. And so
it's so true. And I think part of it is you do have to do your homework. You know, working internationally or being in global roles, there's no shortcuts. You have to do the work if you want to get the best out of that. And I think it's too easy to be either clumsy or lazy when it comes to doing some of that, because you can make faux pas. And I can remember, you know, one of the things that I was learning, that, you know, to smile is a universal gesture, because many other gestures are not universal, right? So for me, it is a little bit about being humble. You know, when you're with people that you want to know a little bit more about, and they want to know a little bit more about you too, right? So I can tell you, being a Sikh in Melbourne, a turban-wearing Sikh, there weren't many of us, right? And I lived in an expatriate bubble. So that was rather unique and different as well. And, you know, being from an ethnic minority group, which means different things in every country, right? Absolutely. So the nuances of, you know, going to India, I still feel like a minority there, because it is very, very different. I may look and fit in physically, but everything else is you're learning as you go. So it's easy to make assumptions. And I think part of what I've learned is that you have to keep stepping back, and you keep asking yourself, what are you trying to achieve? And, you know, and for me, I'm quite impatient. So I have to catch my biases, right? I have to make sure that I'm stopping and thinking before I just launch into an assumption.
I can see these almost inflection points throughout your career where you're checking yourself, because each and every environment is different. It's diverse. You know, we talk about diversity as though it may be, you know, stereotypically one or two things. Actually, it's a plethora of different things. It's intersectionality. And, you know, as you said, you're a turban wearing Sikh, you know, you're a brown senior executive, you know, you come from a working class background. Actually, all of these different factors play a part in the leader that you are today, which in fact I must ask a couple of, maybe challenging questions, but I'm going to go into lightning round, which is kind of my favourite piece.
Okay.
So you got, we should have, we're going to have drinks afterwards. But I'm going to give you a round and about 30 seconds to answer each of the following questions. I'm going to ask my favourite one first. I ask this to lots of people.
Okay.
The answers that I get, very different and pretty amazing. But what would you say is your definition of success?
I think definition for me is about the difference that you're making and the stories that go with that and the influence you have on others.
Ooh, I like that. I like that.
It wasn't quite 30 seconds, but it was good enough.
Well, less than 30 seconds. You could have had longer. And how about what diversity and inclusion means to you, or diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, culture, experience? What does that mean?
I think when we were putting together the function of these three areas, I looked at it outcome first. The so what? Why are we putting this together, and what's it going to do for the organization? So when I look at diversity, I think about, how can I measure that? So it's about pulling apart, I guess, past inequities, that have hampered representation at every level, right? And the biases that are built into processes and systems. When I look at experience, I'm thinking, how do I make sure that the people who are working for Sanofi, we're meeting them where they are. So is our organization accessible, and are we giving them the best possible human experience while at work? And the final piece is that we have to keep sustaining trust, right? This is not like one hit wonder. So building that culture of inclusion and belonging is going to be key, because when I look ahead, certainly my horizon, I don't see us having the answer to all of these questions, right?
And who does, right?
Well, exactly. So we can't stop, keep trying. And, it's about building that trust with people and demonstrating the investment, the time, the energy that you're putting in to make it happen with them, not just for them, but with them. And that's the important bit for me.
I like the piece around trust. And that is definitely a universally understood piece. That was definitely over 30 seconds. However, I'll let you off because you were shorter on the first one. Easy one here. Any favourite books or podcasts or TV series that you're watching at the moment you think that could be inspirational, other than obviously this
clearly.
here today?
Well, there's a small podcast that might rival this with Steve Bartlett. I heard his very first one when I was on a flight, and it was with Professor Stephen Peters, and it was about
Chimp Paradox.
Exactly.
Yes.
I had to go out and buy the book, and I found that super, super fascinating. And I just love the way he brings real life into the conversation. I think I'm a big fan of Grisham, and I love his books, and I think that's, as I was, reading law, I quite liked the fiction that went with that. And I'm a big Netflix watcher, because I'm traveling all the time, so I've got a multitude of things downloaded, and I've just finished on my last trip The Watcher, and actually not a Netflix one, but yesterday we just finished watching The Traitors. I don't know if you've seen The Traitors on BBC, but we binged it in 3-4 days, and it was brilliant.
Okay, so there's two Traitors. Totally agree with everything else, by the way. Mind Management, Chimp Paradox, definitely one to read or download on Audible if you haven't got it. But there's two Traitors. So I said this to Jen, actually, who works with us. I was like, oh my God, The Traitors is amazing. #1 on Netflix. And she was like, oh no, The Traitors with Claudia Winkleman.
Yes, that's
so
the
there's
one.
two different... Oh, so it's that one.
And I didn't think I'd get into it, but it was
types.
super fantastic. I loved it. So I'll wait for the Americans now to 10x it and make it bigger and bolder, right? Like they do with all the programs we have.
Well, now you've said it. That is multiple people that have said The Traitors. I think I'll definitely be watching that.
Easy to download.
Well, my final question, and perhaps the hardest of today, but one which I think is just always a lovely question to ask, especially of those that I admire, I respect, that have done some really great things. But if you could go back in time and you were talking to the young Raj, and this is the Raj that, I'm lucky enough to know used to help his mum with the sewing on an evening when she was doing her multiple jobs. What advice would you give to your younger self, or indeed someone who's listening into this thinking, I'm starting out my career, I'm never going to be there. What advice would you give?
I grew up, with a very strong work ethic, and I think that has been the underlying part of my whole career. But I would say to my younger self, take risks, take them earlier, try different things, and don't be afraid to fail. I think I was afraid to fail as I was growing up. I'm the eldest of my generation, and for me, I probably played it too safe. And I wish I'd done more things differently to be a lot more broader in different areas. And when I started my career in HR, the first bit of advice I got, and the best bit of advice I still remember, was when you're working with people, you've got to be ruthless in your decision making, but compassionate in your delivery, and you should never get them the wrong way around. And I've never forgotten that in everything that I've done throughout my career. And that goes back to just treating people with kindness and respect, regardless of the conversation that you have to have. So my younger self, listen more, learn more, take more risks, have fun along the way, dream big, and see where it takes you.
What a beautiful note to end today's podcast. And to know it's a joy. It's a joy seeing you all the time, actually. But it's a joy in particular actually getting to, share a drink and to see you IRL, as the kids say, in real life. I'm going to do my best to do a summary of today, but it has been a remarkable podcast. It's been wonderful to see you in person. The story from where you have come from to where you are right now is truly inspirational, and actually it proves not only is HR and people and the human element of this so important to the workplace of today, to forward thinking and innovative businesses, but actually we really need to remember that actually it's the outcomes focus that we need to be considering. People get very het up these days on should it be I before D, DEI, DIBE, or culture, or employee experience. Whatever it is, this is about doing business for good, and it's about doing business now and for future generations of leaders who maybe weren't granted those kind of opportunities. And I think what you've done, Raj, is you've broken through the glass ceilings. You've done it in a modest and a humble way, and you've really proved that the harder that you work, the luckier you get. And I think that's something that not only C-suite leaders that are tuning in today can learn from, but also those who are just taking the first steps into their career can also learn from. So thank you ever so much indeed for joining me. It has been a joy. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show by DIBE Global. You can download the podcast if you'd like to tune in weekly. It's on Apple, it's on Spotify, your favourite podcast channels, or you can view online at YouTube if you so wish. Visit us at dialglobal.org/podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you